Hello, and welcome to The Strange Dominions, where we attempt to unlock the mysteries of the unseen and unheard, unknown and unknowable. I am your host, Octavian Graves. Tonight, I am joined by the astrologer herself, Julia Lupton. She and I interview famed astrological magician and author Christopher Warnock. Christopher translated the astrological magic grimoire Picatrix along with John Michael Greer, and has also written Secrets of Planetary Magic, Secrets of Planetary Ritual, and Mentions of the Moon. We talk about his beginnings in magic and the history and use of astrological magic. If you have seen something strange or unusual, such as a cryptid, spirit, UFO, or anything in between, please send me an email at strangedominionspodcast@gmail.com. If you are enjoying the show and would like to get exclusive content, you can become a patron starting at just $4 a month. Patrons get 2 exclusive episodes a month, as well as merchandise and the chance to contribute to the show. With all that being said, I bring you our interview with Christopher Warnock. All right, and tonight I am here with Julia Lupton, my astrological advisor, and we are interviewing Christopher Warnock, astrologer, astrological magician, and author. How you doing?
Great, it's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. We really enjoy reading your books.
Oh, great, fabulous.
Yeah, you're a great writer, and you really put it into terms that I think, anyone interested in the subject can understand. So I guess we'll just start off with some basic background. How did you get into the occult and the astrological magic in the first place?
You know, it's funny because I had a pretty standard suburban upbringing, and I don't know, it's at some point, I think I was an agnostic or whatever, an atheist, whatever that is, and kind of reflexively. And when I went to law school, after I got out of law school, I was in Washington D.C. and I sort of spontaneously became a seeker. And a seeker is sort of somebody who's like a spiritual buffet. There's all this different stuff, and you just sort of sample things, or you just do a lot of reading. An armchair seeker. So as part of that, I was looking at lots of different things. I looked into Sufism, actually was initiated. I got fairly serious about that. But as I was looking around, I kind of got interested in astrology. And it's funny because I did actually, as a lawyer, have a case that involved the definition of a month. And of course, the month is the amount of time it takes the moon to go around the Earth. So we kind of, I sometimes jokingly say that's how I got into it. But I think my wife was telling me that. She said, I think you were just kind of looking around. And so I started reading, going to the bookstore in the astrology section and looking, and there was Dane Rudyard and Liz Green and stuff like that, which was interesting, but it just didn't seem to have the precision of the specificity that I don't know. I just kind of looking for that. And then I stumbled across what at the time was called traditional. It's now basically you call it medieval Renaissance astrology, which is the astrology practice in Europe in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And so in particularly horary astrology, which is you, instead of looking at a birth chart, which is what most people think of being as astrology as, the natal chart, you look at the chart of the question. So if someone has a pressing question, an important question, then you can look at the time of that question and then get the answer from that chart. So I started studying first with Carol Wiggers and then with Lee Lehman. And I finished Lee Lehman's horary course. Then got interested in electional astrology. So electional astrology is kind of the mirror of horary. So electional astrology is picking times that are auspicious to do things. And so got into that. And then I sort of stumbled across astrological talismans. So astrological talismans, astrological magic, basically essentially, this is my definition, is working with astrological spirits, right? And then only at astrologically appropriate times. And so there's a variety of different things you can do. You can make talismans, you can invoke them. There's a variety of different practices that you can take place. But for me, the key is that you only do it at an astrologically appropriate time, and that you only deal with astrological spirits. And so there's all different ways I actually did a video on that recently about the different permutations of that, but that's my personal, and again, I wouldn't say it's wrong to disagree with that, but that's sort of my provisional definition of astrological magic. So I had this kind of a long journey, passing first into traditional or the medieval Renaissance astrology, and then kind of discovering this astrological magic. And at the time, nobody wanted to get involved. Like, for example, I remember Rob Hand was lecturing on Picatrix, which is a very important book of astrological magic, and I said, "Hey, Rob, do you want to make a talisman?" He's like, "Oh no, I don't want to do that." And Bob Zoller, who was sort of my sort of teacher, sort of philosophical teacher, and helped me get going in astrological magic, he didn't make talismans. I actually made a couple for him. So at the time, none of the big, medieval Renaissance astrologers were wanting to get involved. So I just sort of dove in and started looking at our traditional sources, and they had all these very interesting recipes. And I thought, well, I'm going to go ahead and try it. And so, as far as I know, I'm the first person to in the 20th century, 21st century to do it publicly. There probably were people that were doing it privately, but it takes a lot of knowledge of medieval Renaissance astrology, right? And then you also have to be willing to do magic. So one of the interesting things about it is that it's kind of an interesting, I call it hermetic because it's very much on the borderline, because the astrologers often don't want to do magic and magicians don't know astrology. So the astrological magician is a little bit of an odd duck. They kind of combine those two disciplines. I took to it like a duck to water, since we're in a duck metaphor, and really kind of took off with it. And so, that's it. But I really have, as I said, I found astrological magic sort of as part of my spiritual path, and I continue to. In fact, I'm working right now on a book called The Celestial Way that is explaining sort of the preliminary steps of using astrological magic as part of a spiritual path. So, and I was at NORWAC and I gave a whole lecture on that too. So it's kind of come back to that. It's like, the spiritual path and the spiritual side of astrology and magic is something that's increasingly become my focus. And the practice that I have of astrological magic, I call it a devotional practice. So I'm almost more like a celestial priest than an astrological magician. So the spiritual side of it, like I said, has always led me to it in the first place, and it's enriched my spiritual practice. So again, it's not the only way to approach it, but that's what has really resonated with me, is the spiritual side of it.
Christopher, can I ask you a question? In using the astrological magic, are you using the typical astrological degrees, or what an astrologer like myself would understand? For example, if you say, well, if you read a chart, would you read a chart the same way I would?
I mean, you're a modern astrologer?
Yes.
So,
well, not always.
What I think, here's what I would say about it is that there's different schools of astrology, just like there's, say, different types of music.
Sure.
So for example, you have, the blues, or you have someone who plays Bach, who's a classical, musician. And they have, so each school kind of has its own approach, both philosophically and then also in terms of technique. And so one of the problems that we have is that people think that there's astrology in general, and each of the schools is quite different. So what modern astrology typically does is it's very open to bringing in techniques and practices from other styles. So even though someone is basically a modern astrologer and is practicing in that, they'll use a certain amount of other techniques or stuff, but that's not changing them into it's like I said, if I'm just start wearing a cowboy hat, it doesn't make me a cowboy. It's perfectly fine for me to wear a cowboy hat, but it doesn't change me into being a cowboy. So modern astrology is predominantly natal astrology. And it's also very often very psychological. So that's obviously, there's lots of people doing other things with it, but that's the main focus of it. There's a lot of use of Jungian archetypes and things like that. That's very popular. And then the philosophical basis of modern astrology is not very clearly set out. So if you were to ask somebody how it works, it's typically going to be some rays or beams or magnetism or something like that, or they'll talk about synchronicity or symbolism. So that's one of those things that I, again, have been trying to go into a lot more detail, is figuring out how it actually works. So medieval Renaissance astrology was the actual astrology that was practiced in Europe, in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And so if you get a reading from me, it's probably about 90% of what you would have got from somebody, for example, like William Lilly, who was a famous hoary astrologer in the 17th century. And so I do some psychological reading stuff because I think the modern stuff is very useful for that. But I again, add in it's kind of integrated into the way that traditional astrology is done. But in terms of how I do a chart, I mean, that could take, I mean, I have courses that take a year to get through. So it would be, but I'm not a modern astrologer in that sense. I mean, I use the medieval Renaissance style of astrology, and that there's some things that are similar and a lot of stuff that's different.
Well, then I think I have to back up a little bit, Christopher, because my original study of astrology came from places like Lily. And so I think that I used a lot of medieval astrology because I read a lot of it. But I don't think I ever branched out into when I see the things that you've done, I wouldn't have done that, but I'm not exactly a modern astrology either in the way that you portrayed that definition, because I love ancient history, and I began my studies of astrology in medieval astrology. I just maybe what I don't understand is the magic part of it.
I think this goes into a little bit about modality, right? I mean, where I got my start in magic really was Solomonic stuff. And so the big question that comes up a lot is the psychological model versus the spirit model. And I'm wondering if maybe would you say, Chris, that's the big distinction between modern astrology and traditional or medieval astrology is those kind of modalities?
I guess what I would say is that everybody gets to call themselves whatever they want.
Very good.
And
answer.
So you can, if anyone, like I said, I mean, I'm throwing these labels out there, but that's just my particular, what I use for my own purposes. And so if anybody wants to say they're a medieval astrologer, then that's perfectly, you know what I mean? So I don't want to get into some kind of the labeling stuff and all that can be kind of problematic. So what I would say about it is that, there is a fundamental difference between modern people and, people before, and people in traditional societies, and also in, basically before, say, 1700 or so. It's hard to give an exact, maybe before the Enlightenment, which is that the predominant worldview that people have, the view of reality that people have nowadays, is that as what I call atheistic materialism, which is that if you push people on it, really nothing exists except matter and energy. And so when you're talking about spiritual, really that's just kind of a fancy way of talking about psychology, right? And psychology is really from the brain, and the brain is really just, a physical organ, and you're talking about brain function, electrochemical impulses. And so if you push on that, I mean, but at the same time, you have people that, well, I believe in God, right? And that kind of floats out there as a sort of compartmentalized thing. So it's this is an issue that I've been getting into, again, how does astrology work, right? I mean, when we're talking about modalities, that kind of points to that, and that kind of then points to worldview. So, there's a variety of different views of what the causality of astrology is. I think the predominant one for modern people is that some kind of beams or rays or energy, and so, it's not magnetism, because that's none of the stuff's detectable. It's not scientifically detectable. I mean, there are people that think it's actual, it's scientific, but it's not. Or people will talk about symbolic, which that's not really an answer. What is that? What's the causality if it's symbolic? But that, and there were certainly traditional astrologers like Al-Kindi, who's a medieval Arabic astrologer, wrote a book called On the Stellar Rays. So that's certainly out there. There's also someone like Plotinus, who says, the reason that astrology works, that you can predict things with astrology, is that the cosmos is one great unified being, and everything's tied together, these chains of spiritual correspondence. And then I guess what I would say my personal favorite at the moment, because again, these are just different models, I mean, none of them can be said to be the truth, is that if you think about dream causality, like if you have a dream and you see a hill in the dream and the ball rolls down a hill and smashes a bottle, what's the causality there? Was there a ball, or was it really a bottle? The causality really is that there's one dreamer, that there's a unified consciousness. So again, since I'm coming from sort of a Buddhist perspective, that's what I would probably say that my favorite model at the moment of causality is. But I think that that's something that people typically nowadays don't think too much about, that sort of thing. They want to jump in and just do it. Whereas your worldview very much determines what is even possible, and it's pretty much I mean, reality is reality, right? I mean, how could you even think there's any, I mean, and what I think my reality is everybody's reality, right? And so that's the general approach. So what you have typically is people that have, like I said, this unconscious atheistic materialism, which is to say nothing exists except matter and energy, and then they layer over it. Like the New Age approach would be to be not realize that that's how you think things work, and then do astrology and magic on top of it. And so if you ask people about how does it work, then they're like a little flummoxed about it, or they're, like I said, they're beams, rays, like Star Trek, energy.
Christopher, a lot of times when I was interviewed on a television show or on a radio, people ask that exact question. Well, Ms. Lupton, how does it work? Or why does it work? And they seem to think that there is some sort of a magical ray that comes down from Jupiter or Saturn or whatever. And I have to carefully explain that it's not the planet that comes and makes your dream come true, or the question asked doesn't rely on the movements that a planet actually makes. It's what we have learned from watching the movements of the planets, which is, you have to admit, is what astrology is based on, or that the observances we've made over thousands of years. Now, I agree with you that I don't particularly believe in the psychology approach to this thing. There is a way that it works. I can't always explain it on a radio audience, but it's not the Mars in reaching down and with his cold hand and grasping us around the neck that makes somebody die. They get a terrible view from modern astrology of what it is and what it isn't. And I have a tough time trying to get out of that question because we really don't know how it works. That's
not much of an answer.
No, it's not an answer at all. But you can't get if you're being interviewed, you can't get into the question of spirits and the question of a world that belongs outside.
Well, I do.
Well, of course you do, but
because it's 2022. Here's what I would say about it is that these are all models, and I wouldn't want to point to any of them and say that any of them is wrong. They're useful depending on what perspective you're at, and they're more or less useful, more or less accurate depending on those circumstances and perspective. So the beams and rays stuff, I mean, it's adequate as a model for particular perspectives. But what it does show, like I said, the most important thing is to be aware of what your models are and aware of what your worldview is, because otherwise it's unconscious and you're being controlled by the model without even knowing what it is. So that's what I would say about it, is that, the beams and rays stuff is what automatically jumps into people's minds. I mean, it reminds me of, I get a lot of, or I haven't had it right now because you get these fads of people emailing me. I guess, it clicks into this with a tropical versus sidereal zodiac. And they're confused about that. And what they think, they're like, well, it's closer to the real stars. Well, the reason that they're interested, they think that's the best, and that's automatically going to that, is because matter is the only thing that really exists. And so if it's closer to the material stars, that's the most true thing, because it has to correspond to matter, matter being the only thing that really exists and the thing that's most true. Again, that's an atheistic materialistic perspective. And I wouldn't say it's wrong. I'm just saying that you need to understand that that's the perspective you're coming from, and that's why that's automatically appeals to people as an answer.
Oh, then they like to bring up the precession of the equinoxes, and I'm not really a Pisces, I'm an Aries, or wherever the equinox is by this time. It went out of Aquarius into Pisces, and so they know that it goes eastward at a very slow rate. What is it, 72 degrees a year? And so there's a big question in a lot of students, more students than clients. Clients just want answers to things, and especially my clients who are businessmen. But the students that I had don't understand the difference between using sidereal astrology and tropical astrology, which is what I was teaching them. But you have to, at one point, explain. In the end, they both started zero Aries, but it's very difficult to explain what you know. I didn't know. I didn't know the type of astrology that you do I only know the Western astrology, and I don't necessarily think I was a modern astrologer because I don't fit the form that you just mentioned. I think there are spirits. I think there are a lot of things I didn't know about astrology, but they can be certainly explained to a willing audience about, well, look, here's what Mars means in classical astrology. Here's what it can do if you use I don't know that you make any difference between the sidereal and tropical zodiac. What do you base your astrology on, one or the other, or both?
I guess I'm a little confused here because it seems like there's a lot of. I'm not sure if you're going to interview me or this is supposed to be a.
Yeah, she was just giving her input about, from her perspective, what her experience has been, and then kind of comparing that to yours as a way to understand the differences between traditional astrology and what we would call modern astrology.
Okay.
The one thing that I wanted to know about was if we go back to like the source material, which it would primarily be the Picatrix for astrological magic, correct?
For if you're talking about medieval Renaissance astrology, that was probably the primary text that was used, by those astrological magicians. It's interesting because there are other manuscripts out there. They just, in books that weren't just quite as popular. Again, I was mentioning this book Astromagia, which is translated about the same time and together with Picatrix, but just wasn't attained its fame. It's interesting because there's a book called the Shams al-Marif, which is called the Sun of Wisdom, that is much more popular in the modern Arabic world, in Islamic magic and things like that. And they've sort of heard of Picatrix, but the Shams al-Marif is the one that has the great fame now. So it's just interesting sort of accident of history that became so popular in the West. But yeah, that is the primary source. And it's interesting because it combines both sort of recipes, that you might expect from a grimoire, sort of practical instructions, with a lot of philosophical material as well. And so it's also kind of a compilation. I mean, the author, it's funny because the author is referred to as Picatrix as well as the book being called Picatrix, says he looked at over 200 books. And you can see that. He'll go through and summarize this book and summarize that book. So there's a lot of sort of miscellaneous material in Picatrix. And it has an incredibly wide range. This very sublime philosophical stuff, and then there's all these listings of take the brain of a black dog and the blood of a white dove and things like that, which I don't have anything to do with, being a Buddhist. But it has a very wide range of different things in it. And so yeah, Picatrix is kind of our primary source. And but in order to use it, you need to have this basically fully full use of medieval Renaissance astrology. You need to be able to do pretty high-level electional astrology, full chart elections. The typical, if you look at the Solomonic grimoires, they will use like planetary hours, and they maybe even like the moon in particular signs. So that's sort of the magician elections. But the full chart stuff, where you're using multiple factors, and that's much more complex and something that the typical magician probably wasn't up to speed on. And so that's where the Picatrix kind of jumps out there in terms of the complexity of the magic that it's using, the astrology.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about because obviously in Solomonic we have the days and hours of the planets, and spirits are ruled by that kind of hierarchy. And I'm wondering if more Solomonic magicians would benefit from astrological magic, or if it can be integrated into the Solomonic tradition in any way, or if they're more separate than together.
It's interesting because, I was talking about, this idea that astrological magic is only working with astrological spirits and then only interacting with them at astrologically appropriate times. So you have these, and, nowadays there's different variations. So, for example, you have situations like the Solomonic grimoires where they're not astrological spirits as such, right? I mean, they'll be goetic or whatever. Yet there's certain times that are, astrologically, like planetary hours, or the lunar days of the moon, or maybe even the moon in signs that are appropriate for calling upon them. So you're sort of supercharging your regular magic, right, by doing it in an astrologically appropriate time, but you're not dealing with astrological spirits. There's also people that say that if I'm going to invoke Jupiter, which is an astrological spirit, I don't have to do it at an appropriate time for Jupiter astrologically. And that's, again, I think from some sort of magician perspective, they don't want to wait around. They want to do it now. They don't want to wait, 6 months or a year or whatever till Jupiter is an appropriate time. And so basically what they say is that, well, I've got a good enough relationship with Jupiter, I don't need to do that, or I do a big enough ritual. And so these are all sort of different variations that are possible of it. And what's interesting about it is I ran across this Renaissance source that was talking about exactly that in the Renaissance, of people following those different paths. So I think those are all legitimate. And again, you can all say those are astrological magic. You know what I mean? In one hand, you're invoking Jupiter, so that's astrological and it's magic, right? Or I'm using astrology to time my Solomonic magic. So these are all varying. So, but what I'm doing is the middle with both of them. But I wouldn't, again, say that's right or the only way to do it, right? Or that there's any, again, the whole labeling thing, it's that I don't want to get into being pejorative about how you label stuff. Everyone's got their own path. Everyone does the thing that resonates for them. And that's what's most important. And so, but yeah, I mean, that's what's kind of interesting about the Solomonic stuff is that they want to punch up their power by using that timing. And they're using stuff that's fairly straightforward. Figuring planetary hours. That's, we use a calculator now, but, basically you just need to go sunrise to sunset, right? And then you divide it by 12, and then you can plot out, if it's at the equinoxes in the northern hemisphere, it's going to be about an hour. If it's in the summertime, obviously the days are longer than the nights. You just have to get that calculation right. And then in terms of like the phases of the moon or what the days of the moon are, again, those are fairly straightforward for people to do. And so that's a way that people can do that, their magic, right? And sort of punch up the power. Now, one of the things I started off with before we had Picatrix and had the ritual from that, because it has very extensive ritual in it, was I was doing hoodoo and root work, the southern folk magic, and I was timing it. Like, for example, I would do a wealth, mojo bag, right? And I would do it with Jupiter. So Jupiter day, Jupiter hour, and have some Jupiter symbols on the petition paper, and then do that. So that was a way, because there is a certain amount of astrology that was integrated into the root work. It's mostly African magic, but it's maybe about 25% European. Like do bibliomancy, things like that. They were typically using like the zodiacal man, which, the Aries is the head, Taurus is the neck, Gemini is the shoulders and arms. It maps the signs to the parts of the body. So for example, if you had a headache, you could do a headache remedy while the sun, moon usually was in Aries. So that kind of was integrated into that folk magic, because that's kind of floating around in the sort of folk magic of the Europeans. And so that's what I would say about it, is that there's definitely a lot of opportunities to, if you want to just sort of punch up the power of the magic that you're doing, you can add that sort of basic astrological timing into it but a lot of people they'll say, I got Picatrix and I don't understand how to use it. And I'm like, well, that's kind of like getting an advanced neurosurgery handbook. It's like, you need to go to medical school to understand how to use that. And so basically my astrological magic course, probably the fastest you get through it is about 10 months. It's like a graduate course that teaches all the astrology that you need to do Picatrix. And so that's kind of necessary in terms, and like, for example, Cornelius Agrippa in his 3 books of occult philosophy, he talks about talismans. He says, oh, this is dealt with in the books of the astrologers, all the background and everything you need. So the full scale stuff, particularly if you're doing house-based talismans, which are the most difficult to do, because you're using multiple planets and you got to get the houses, rulership lined up and everything. Those are the most complex, and those really do take, some skill in terms of the knowledge that you have and also being able to find elections for it. But there's a whole different levels of ways you can integrate into it and knowledge that you can use.
One of the things I wanted to ask you is, going through the Picatrix, you see a lot of these really hard to obtain and almost impossible to obtain ingredients and things to do the rituals, such as, I don't remember which planet it is that you're trying to invoke, but you can either cut off the head of a leopard, or if you don't have a leopard, you could use a mouse. Have you found any correspondences for a modern person to do Picatrix magic with things that are available to them, or is there kind of just a one way of doing it and that's it?
Here's the thing. Like I said, Picatrix was compiled from many different sources, right? There's over 200 different books in there that they used. And so a lot of what they call the confecciones, which are these combinations of, like you said, the brain of this or the head of that, are from a book called Nabatean Agriculture. But in any case, what these are natural magic, right? So, and Agrippa wrote a book called Three Books of Occult Philosophy, and it's got 3 books, and it talks about the 3 worlds. And the 3 worlds are the divine world, the celestial world, and then the natural world, the material world. And then he explains the magic that is appropriate to each of these. Like, for example, Kabbalah is divine magic, right? Astrological magic is celestial magic, and then natural magic, or the occult virtues of things is. So essentially what you're doing is it's a lot like, gemstones. We have that today. Like, oh, this particular gemstone is good for this, these has these qualities or helps you with these things. And you don't need to do anything with it. It just naturally has those qualities because of what it is, right? And so a lot of those are basically just natural magic. And so if you're talking about a leopard, then the leopard has that whatever magical quality because it's a leopard, right? And so that's what those. Now, I'm a Buddhist, and I'm not going to do anything having to do with blood or flesh or, like I said, blood sacrifice or anything like that. I mean, I don't want the kind of spirits that are going to show up with. Someone said to me, "Oh, get a pork chop." I'm like, I don't want any spirits that are showing up wanting blood or meat. I only deal with archangelic or angelic spirits of the manifestations of things. So I just don't do that. And if you look at the society that these came out of, in the Middle Ages or before, I mean, they were doing lots of animal sacrifice. Even in the Jewish faith, I mean, they're doing it in the temple, right? There's tons of animal sacrifice in the temple, and the Greeks, of course, the pagans were doing lots of animal sacrifice. That was just a normal part of their life. Now, I can't be too condemnatory of it because we eat meat, It's not sacred. We have these factory farms, and there's we don't look at it, right? So I don't think we really can go around how morally superior we are about it. But personally, I'm not going to do anything like that. But it's certainly not necessary for Picatrix. I mean, the sections that I'm looking at as far as making talismans really have nothing to do with the necessity of having the sacrifice. And here's what I would say about sacrifice. I think there's a lot of spiritual or magical power that comes from death, from killing something. But that's not a spiritual power that I want to have anything to do with, and it's certainly not necessary to do that. So, Picatrix does have, I think it's book 3, chapter 7, which has these very extensive rituals of the Harani and Sabians, and they're, really renowned as having this astrological religion, that their prophet was Hermes Trismegistus. They produced a tremendous amount of philosophy and science and things like that, and astrology, astrological magic, and it may well be the source of the Picatrix. And their religion involved animal sacrifice. So that's listed in there. But I have not found that that's an absolute necessity for that. I mean, it's just it's and so this idea that, oh, I've seen the modern thing of well, they say you have to kill a ram, but you can actually, instead of that, you can use sage, So that seems like a modern thing to do. I don't think that's necessarily. I mean, or they say it's code words. They didn't really mean the black cat. That actually meant this leaf, and they had to say it that way. Again, I mean, it's possible, and that I'm not going to say that people are wrong for doing that, but my personal view of it is that they meant what they said, and since they meant what they said, I'm not going to go ahead and be doing animal sacrifice. It's possible to look at the essence of what they're working and not have to be doing any kind of dealing with these particular. Now, the furthest I've ever gone with that is there's a talisman called Alkide, which is a fixed star, and it's in the tail of the great bear, and it's a protective talisman. And one of the things it says is that it protects, I think, against, I think it's spiritual protection, but also thieves. And I think it's if you have a wolf tooth with it, that it also protects against robbers or something like that. So this friend of mine who I was working with at the time, actually sent me a wolf tooth. And so they're not an endangered species, and I don't think they had to be killed to get the tooth. I think that was sort of a byproduct. So, I mean, I wouldn't go out and kill them, but I do actually have a wolf tooth sitting on my altar because that goes along with that. But nevertheless, that's probably, I wouldn't have probably gone out and done that on my own. But that's just a personal view, and I just prefer to stay away from any kind of killing, and stuff like that. But I mean, other people have different approaches. And again, if you were in, a pagan, right? They would have the sacrifice and they'd have a big feast. That's not a whole heck of a lot different from 4th of July where you're having a, burger outing, except that's for a sacred purpose, So, I mean, I think everyone's got to figure out for themselves what they want to do. But yeah, I just don't there's big chunks of it with all these different confecciones and parts of animals and stuff that I've never done and never will do in Picatrix.
Okay, well, since we're on the subject of rituals, obviously I'm coming from a Solomonic background here, but is there any kind of ritual restrictions that are required of the magician to do astrological magic, such as abstinence and fasting and things like that? Or is that sort of more on the Solomonic side and less on the astrological magic side as far as rituals go?
Part of this is coming from the fact that I'm coming from a devotional approach. And so, you know, depending on who you're dealing with, right? You need to take a different approach. Like, for example, in the Solomonic stuff, a lot of times I get the impression that the spirits are kind of rambunctious, you know, and you need to have this protective gear, and you need to have these magical circles to protect yourself, and then circles to imprison with goetic stuff in particular. You need to sort of protect yourself from the spirits. You don't want to be in their presence, unprotected. Whereas, if you're going to go to church and you're going to do a rosary, right? You don't need to worry about a magical circle to protect yourself from, Mary, the Queen of Heaven, or if you're going to do, it's just not, that's not kind of in your mind. If you're going to do a saint, you've got a chaplet, or you're going to do a chaplet to a particular saint or angel or something, you don't need to be so freaked out about that. So at the same time, you're not going to be able to tell them what to do. You're not going to be able to go down and say, St. Michael, you get your ass in here and hurry up and give me what I want. You basically kind of have to take what you get with them. And that's kind of what I like about dealing with the angels and angelic manifestations of these, entities, the spirits. Because that's why I look at Mars. I mean, Mars, for example, you can, I think, interface with it in all sorts of different ways. You can interface with it at an angelic or archangelic level. You can interface at a demonic, daemon, not a demon. And I think there's probably some demons that are associated with Mars as well. And so there's, I think, an infinite number of different types of spirits and different levels you can interface at. And so, for example, like if you were going and doing a blood sacrifice, that's not going to attract the same spirits as, you might get from a more devotional approach. And so that's part of, like, by me only doing positive magic and only looking for positive purposes for things, never doing malefic magic, never doing blood sacrifice or things like that, and all working at archangelic level, I don't feel the necessity of, magical circles or protective gear or things like that. The downside is that, again, you can't force them to do anything. You can't make a deal. I mean, you basically have to, you can ask, but that doesn't mean that they're going to hop to and give you what you want automatically. I mean, it's like, it's a different modality, as you say. And that's what everyone needs to find is what are you comfortable with? What are you looking for? What's the path that resonates for you? And everyone kind of, attracts that. And again, I wouldn't want to say I'm right and everyone else is wrong, or I'm good and everyone else is bad. It's really, everyone has a path, and everyone needs to find that the style that resonates for them. But that's what and see, astrological magic, if you look at Picatrix, a lot of the goals are pretty mundane. And there's a lot of bad stuff too. I mean, I was looking at Mansions of the Moon, and I'm like, every single one seemed to be like, get the king to destroy your enemies, and separate these people, and all that. And I'm like, I don't want to do this stuff. So those are probably, talismans I'm never going to make. But at the same time, it's, so that's what I would say about it. The other thing that's interesting about just historically is that Picatrix, it came into Europe, is translated into Castilian Spanish and then into Latin at the court of Alfonso the Wise in Castile about 1256. And so that was available then in the 13th century. But the people that were making use of it were typically there's a professor called Kiekeffer calls the clerical underworld. And so there's a lot of unemployed sort of priests and, people that they were well educated, but they didn't have a lot to do, or started getting into all this stuff. And they started doing, or monks, because they had you had to understand astrology and be able to read Latin and do all the stuff to do that. So it was the astrological magic, the full scale Picatrix stuff was not done by a lot of people. It wasn't super popular. And it was more kind of followed in the earlier, like I said, the 13th, 14th, 15th century. As you get into the 15th, 16th, 17th century, the Solomonic stuff starts becoming more popular. And that, it doesn't take as much heavy-duty knowledge, astrological knowledge, and more lay people were learning Latin and could read the text, and the text would show up, for example, in English. As you get later in the period, they're getting in English. And so the Solomonic stuff was way more popular in the Middle Ages and Renaissance than the Picatrix-style astrological magic. And that's still true today for basically the same reasons. Is that it's a lot easier to get into. It's also just more available. You know what I mean? You can get the Mathers, Goetia and stuff like that. It's widely available, easy to understand for, you can just do the stuff. And so again, it's just kind of interesting how the same patterning in the Middle Ages is now showing up now. And also there's a lot of Solomonic manuscripts around.
Right.
Mathers was able to find it fairly easily.
And there's a lot that haven't even been translated yet.
Exactly. And so it's just interesting how that's coming about. And, it's just cool to be at a time where so much of the stuff is available and so many things are being translated, and everyone can pretty much, like I said, you can go through and sample things, and you can find out what really resonates for you. And that's the most important thing, and I wouldn't want to point to anything and say that's, now I get a little, the Goetic stuff, I never really had a desire to do that because it's just, I was guided to the angelic stuff, but that's not to say that that's not, perfectly valid and useful stuff for people to, if they're into that, to do. But again, the main question you're asking is, you basically don't have to worry about, what you do want to do is, in the style that I'm using, is that you want to approach them respectfully, right? And
but there's no 9 days of sexual abstinence and no meat or anything like that prior to the actual invocation.
Yeah, you don't have to do that. But you don't want to just, because I've had people, like, for example, had these fixed star talismans, and they were getting frustrated because they didn't understand how to do the election. I said, no, I'll do one for you, or you can hire me to do it. If you get a talisman for me, a fixed star talisman, I'll do one for free, and then you could hire me to do it if you don't know how to do it yourself. But so I'll just do it anytime. I said, no, that wouldn't be respectful. That's like calling somebody up at 3:00 in the morning.
Yeah, I just used that a very similar analogy today, actually. But speaking about the Picatrix, and you brought up the Shemhem Arif, which I just listened to an interview with the two people who translated it last year, or at least a few select chapters of it. My original question was, is the Picatrix the only astrological grimoire, or are there more?
There's a lot.
Okay.
I mean, they're not, like, for example, there's a book called De Imaginibus by Thabit Menkura, which explains how to do house-based talismans. Okay? And so that's, John Greer did a translation of it, and then I've got that published as, it's called Astral High Magic is the title of that book. There's also, for example, a book, it's a manuscript called Hermes on the 15 Fixed Stars, and that's on my website. It's very short, and that's circulated, and that's also, but there's also a ton of stuff floating around that we don't have access to. Like, for example, there was this academic project called Hermes Latinus. I was trying to do Latin critical editions of all the works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus in the Middle Ages, and they were going to do astrological magic, and they had, I was sort of salivating over all these different titles that I had no knowledge of, So there's a lot of stuff that's still locked up in manuscript, and so the other thing is that after doing this now for over 20 years, this year, actually last year or the year before, I added Fomalhaut, which is not one of the 15 fixed stars. I did a talisman of Fomalhaut. Now, part of it is that Fomalhaut is conjunct a prominent planet in my chart, and then I also did some divination about it. And so a sort of a sigil of because it's the southern fish. Fomalhaut means the southern fish. It's the mouth of the southern fish. It's kind of a fish-based. It looks kind of like, the sigil looks a bit like a fish, and it's got like the incense and stuff that I felt was appropriate for it was sort of fishy. It's sort of blue was the colors, things like that. It's fish-based. But I'm actually going to make some talismans that aren't from Picatrix. So, but the thing is that having done it long enough, like, for example, I'm wanting to do a Venus, I call it Venus Cup, because I have a beautiful image that Nigel Jackson, one of my early artists, did for me, sort of like this couple, and they've got this cup, and it's going to be for, also they've got like a sitar. So it's going to be for, like, particularly for artists and musicians and creative people. So it's like a Venus talisman, but really focused on creativity, also love. Because
I'm a musician, so that'd be very interesting for me.
But we don't have it's not from a particular grimoire, But it makes sense because you can think of, Venus, obviously that's what she rules, right? I've got this beautiful image that's appropriate, and then also I'm going to do it at a time that's appropriate for Venus. So finally, after 20 years, I'm going to just do a little innovation, but it's still within the tradition. You know what I'm saying? I'm not overthrowing anything, but I'm also, because you get this problem of, like, people will come in and they'll immediately overthrow everything, right? Or they're like, okay, I have to follow it exactly. And if it's not in the book, I can't do anything. So there's a middle path between, totally changing everything the first second you start learning it, and then not refusing to change anything that's right in the book. So being a master of this, having done thousands of talismans, having sort of spent 20 years, deeply, imbuing myself with it, it's a bit like, like the blues. If you just copy the lick that your teacher did, right, note for note, you're just kind of stuck. But if you innovate too much, you're not playing the blues anymore, which is fine. You don't have to play the blues, right? But there's a point at which you're not even in that tradition anymore. But if you're a master of the tradition, you can be very individualistic, have your own style, but nevertheless remain within that tradition. I think the music metaphor is a good way of understanding that, and that's so that I am actually going to step out a little bit this year, and I think I'm going to do a cat talisman too. I think it's gonna be a Saturn-based talisman, because my wife said, "Why don't you do a talisman for a cat?" I'm like, okay, so we'll do a cat talisman, because cats are ruled by the moon and by Saturn. Those are the rulerships. So I'm going to do a really strong Saturn talisman and have a nice cat image on it. But again, there's no grimoire that has cats in it, But I thought, it's ruled by Saturn. I can do a really good election, and I think that'll be an interesting. And I got a good divination. That's what I did with these. I'll do like a divination for it, and I got a positive result. So that's kind of the seal of approval. So that's kind of. But I think what I would say is, if you go on the internet and read a couple posts in social media, and then 15 minutes later you're going to change everything, that's a problematic approach, So it's sort of like there is something it's like if you picked up a guitar and started restringing it or whatever, and it would sound terrible. You know what I mean? You need to get to the point where you really understand everything and the essence of it before you can innovate. And the student needs to kind of, like I said, copy closely, but there's a point at which the mastery is reached where you can go ahead and be on your own. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm afraid, like I said, you get it from both sides, because people are like, it's not in the book, and I'm like, someone's like, oh, but I can change everything right off the bat anyway. So it's like, no, there's a sort of a middle path there with doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you go into your classes and how that works? So if someone really wanted to learn how to do this, how your classes work?
Yeah, as everything, I have to be weird. I mean, I think about, maybe it's the Aquarian influence or something, but I seem to be outside the mainstream. The way that it seems like 100% of classes are done now is it's always taped lectures. Now, it could be video or it could be audio, but that's all there is. And so what you do, or you could live. Those are your choices. Do you have live lectures, or are they taped?
Yeah, I'm actually in 3 classes, one on Solomonic, one on PGM, and one on St. Cyprian, and one is live, one is audio, and one is video. So yeah, absolutely.
My classes are written.
Okay.
Which blows everybody's mind. But it's like, basically it's like a correspondence course. And so, but it makes sense, because, the thing about it is that if you could only pick up information about medieval Renaissance astrological magic from a video, you're going to get a tiny amount of information, because there's a huge tradition out there, but it's all written. And so if you're not able to read the sources and extract the information from those sources and learn from them, you're not going to be able to do anything. So essentially, and the other advantage of my course is that you can go at your own pace. Now you can't zip through it, but you can go as slow as you want. And you can fit it in with your life. So I have 2 types of courses. I have mini courses, which are sort of like self-contained. Like I have a planetary magic mini course that explains how to use planetary hours, for example, and you can make talismans using planetary hours. And that's sort of like one lesson of the bigger course. And then I have this big astrological magic course, which teaches sort of the entire. It's like I said, like a graduate course, And it does involve a lot of writing and definitely a lot of reading. And the way I do the full courses is that you work through the courses in order, through lessons in order, and I'm available for any questions that students have necessary to complete the current lesson's homework. So it's not like you're just on your own. But the other problem I get is that people will be like, oh, I'm on lesson 1, but I want to talk about lesson 7. I'm like, no, you need to get to lesson 7. You need to work through it. And there is a tendency for people to want to do, I'm almost like they think I'm like a waiter, and they can just order up the stuff. They don't want to bother going through the course. They just want to ask a bunch of questions, and that's not a very effective way to do it. But there's no tests, there's no grades, there's no deadlines. It's really kind of cool, because all my students are adults. They're all only doing it because they're interested in it, and they're really great. It's awesome to have students like that really are only interested in the knowledge, part of it. It's also, So it's very focused on, the practical, and learning how to do this stuff. We do some philosophical stuff basically to help us, ultimately for the practical ends of it. It's sort of scholarly, but the problem with academic stuff is you don't get any practical knowledge with it. So we try to get a balance. We do start with worldview and get the background, but everything is always focused on learning so you understand it and to actually do astrological magic. And I do teach horary and natal astrology, electional astrology as well. I have full courses.
Okay, very cool. Now, I have one question, and this is going back to just my understanding of magic in general. Is there any kind of, physical evocation element to any Picatrix rituals, or is that just kind of not part of it at all?
I don't really understand that. It seems like there's this idea that out there that, well, you're not successful unless you see the spirits, and you're going to have a physical manifestation of the spirits, which again seems to me to be this sort of manifestation of the atheistic materialism. I mean, it's not really real unless there's a physical manifestation, right? I mean, and that's because that's the ultimate reality is material. And so if you don't actually have a material manifestation, then it's not really real. You can't really be sure of it. It's also, but that's kind of hard for the spirits, right? I mean, one of the interesting experiences that I've had, there's a talisman or a fixed star called Algol, which has a kind of nefarious reputation in predictive astrology, but is actually a very, very, probably the most effective protective spiritual protection talisman. And a lot of people have, not everybody, but a lot of people, I've had over 100 people tell me this, and I had the same experience, is that when they first get the talisman, they have some kind of electrical or internet, or electronic interference, and I had somebody said their whole building shut down, the electricity, when the day they got it, the everything shut down in the entire building, the elevators and everything. And I had somebody had the entire block had a power outage. For me, I had had the weirdest internet interference. They had never seen it before, and it's just temporary. But you can see the spirits are closer to electronics and internet. It's easier for them to do that, right? Or people that have dreams. I mean, people get a talisman, I had this amazing dream. It's like, yeah, it's a lot easier to do that. But I want bags of gold to materialize on my front doorstep. That's a lot harder for them to do since they're spiritual. And so to expect an immaterial, entity to have a physical manifestation, I think is they're out of their element. It's like asking a fish to go up on the land, And so personally, I mean, I've talked to numbers of people that talk to spirits. I have a good friend of mine who's just telling me, I talked to the sun angel last night and he told me this and that. And I'm like, for me, I've never had that direct contact, right? I mean, I've sort of had a sense of seeing the spirits in my mind's eye, right? Or sort of out of the corner of my eye. Maybe I've had a kind of stuff like that. But I don't disbelieve people that say, I talk to the spirit. But personally, I've never done that. And I don't regard that as the be all and the end all of, that's what I'm trying to do this for. And if I don't get that, it's a failure, and that's the whole purpose of it. It seems to be it seems to be a little obsession with the evocation stuff. You know what I mean? And so, if that's what people are into, that's what they're into. But I'm kind of the guy as far as the Picatrix stuff, and I don't do that. It's not really there's so many people doing it now that maybe somebody is doing that. You know what I mean? It's like it's turned into this huge community, and it could be, but that's never been something that and partly it's because I don't do it myself. I mean, I guess I'd have to give up because I've never had physical evocation, and I'd have to hang up my wand or robe or whatever. So that's not something that is particularly. Nor do I think it's that. I think it's modern. I don't see that in the sources. Now, I think that if you read the sources, it's a little difficult to tell whether it's a little fantasy, like fairy tale stuff too. It's hard to know whether they mix stuff in there. You know what I mean?
Well, like you were saying before about how the modern mindset is that the ancients were doing everything in metaphors, that they didn't really mean this. The way that at least I read the grimoires, when it says that a spirit comes as in the shape of a king with a dog's head and a frog's legs and things like that, I can't say I've ever seen that. I mean, but I imagine that at some point someone may have seen that. That may be a way that this spirit manifests. So I tend to take it more on a literal basis than on a metaphysical or a metaphorical basis. So but I know what you mean.
I would agree with you because what I would say is that, somebody probably saw that, right? Now, you could be in a sort of hypnagogic state, It could be somebody who's really sensitive to that sort of thing. You could have had a vision, right? It could happen sometimes. They could show up in a different form. You know what I mean? You could have wind. You know what I'm saying? It seems to me that there's a lot of different possibilities as far as that. And it's a bit like, psychics, right? I mean, I don't have any basic doubt that it's possible to be psychic, right? But that doesn't mean that any individual person, of course they work. But I'm not going to disbelieve it off the bat just because it's impossible either. You know what I mean? So that's what I would say about that, is that I think that the moderns think it's metaphoric because they're unconscious atheistic materialists. I mean, that's the thing, is they don't really believe in the stuff anyway. I mean, why are you doing magic if you don't think it really works? You know what I mean? That just seems like but that's the state that most people are in terms of this. And that's why what you started off with the modalities was such a deep question, because the model that you have of causality reveals very clearly what your worldview is. And so how you think things work is a way of quickly getting to what people's view of what reality is. And the weird thing about that is there's lots of different types of reality. That's what's bizarre about worldview, is that if you have a spiritual worldview, then you live in a world of spirits. If you have an atheistic materialistic worldview, then you live in a world of matter and energy. And it's possible to shift, but I don't know if it's possible for an individual. I mean, it can be done, but it's not by you, so to speak. You know what I mean? So it's a weird thing. But anyhow, yeah. So I think it's funny how what I've noticed is over the 20 years I've done this is that there's more and more acceptance of the reality of magic and astrology and spirituality. And you've got more and more people that are experiencing it, and more and more people that are open to it, the reality. And then also what I've been trying to do is to give a firm foundation, and like I said, in terms of philosophy and in terms of the practical use of stuff, say this really works and this is why. Now, it's not going to make sense to you if you're an atheistic materialist, right? Because nothing's spiritual. But if you accept the existence of the spiritual, then we can actually say how the stuff works or give models. You know what I mean? To say definitively how it works, I think, is foolish, right? Because then you're not recognizing that you're at a particular perspective and you're using a model, But it's interesting, because I had a girlfriend in college who was a physicist, and she said to me, and this struck me to this day, she said, "Oh, we're modeling." So the physicists, they're not saying, "Oh, this is the ultimate objective reality," right? This is just a model, and we'll use it as long as it works. And it's got some problems, and it's good for certain things. It's like a wrench. I mean, I've got an Allen wrench; it'll work for this particular thing, right? But it won't work for when I need a hex wrench, right? And so that's essentially what these are. And if we think that we know the answer, then we're deluding ourselves. That's the. But at the same time, certain things are going to resonate for you more than others. Certain things are going to be more appropriate to you depending on your karma, your background, what kind of person you are, and what kind of situation you're in, and that's why. But it's cool that there's so much magic now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
I really like that.
Yeah. Well, Chris, this is a perfect place to stop. But where can people find all your information, and where can they find you if they want to get into astrological magic themselves?
They're obviously my website, Renaissance Astrology. I apologize for the fact it's sort of Paleolithic. It's ridiculously old. It's like a 20-year-old website. So there are more and more mobile responsive pages on it, so you can at least, don't have to mess with your phone. But it's still, I've really realized that I can't update it. I mean, I might set up a separate website just for like buying talismans and courses and stuff, so it's easily accessible. But there's no way to have an 800-page website that's, going to be, happy. Google's going to be happy with it. So, but renaissanceastrology.com is really a great place to look. But, it's amazing, and you can, again, they've got books, I've got courses, I've got talismans, I've got all sorts of stuff. But what's really amazing is just all sorts of people are springing up doing this. It's become really a community. And where I was the only one 20 years ago, there's an incredible number of people doing it in all sorts of different ways and stuff. So it's really great. I mean, it's people like Austin Coppock. I don't want to go into too many different people because I'm going to leave somebody out that's important. But, for example, I met Austin and Caitlin Coppock at the NORWAC for the first time, and they were awesome. So there's all sorts of different people. I mean, Cliff Lowe, there's lots of different people out there, and it's becoming very diverse too. There's all sorts of different people that are getting into it. So I would say there's just get out there, look around, and you'll be amazed at the different kinds of people and information that's out there. It's just really kind of exploding.
Chris, I just wanted to tell you that was a most interesting conversation between you and your friend here. I hope to look more into some of your other books besides the Mansions of the Moon, and maybe learn some of the fixed stars, which I guess I don't have as a astrologer. My classical astrology didn't include the sidereal part of it, but you've made me a real fan of the things that you do. And
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Well, the thing is that for me, that what I always have to remember is that there's always more for me to learn, and it doesn't matter how old we get, there's always more stuff. And I never have the final word. As soon as I think, because I'm very opinionated, and as soon as I say something, I'm like, you know what? There's always another way to go about this. So that's the great thing about this, is there's so many people, so much useful stuff, and I really appreciate your comments and the insightful questions that you're asking today. So it's really had a lot of fun today. Thanks, guys, for having me.
No, it was our pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
So long,
it was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. You have a great day.
All right, great. Okay, bye.
Bye.
That was my interview with Christopher Warnock with the assistance of Julie Lupton. All of the links for Christopher's website and books will be in the show notes below. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you again in the Strange Dominions.